Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction of Mind and Will. This week, we're beginning a new topic, talking about artificial intelligence. So, we're going to be looking at two different readings. We're going to look at Turing's Computing Machinery and Intelligence, but also John Searle's Can Computers Think? Okay, so the idea is this. There's a lot of interesting topics around AI, right? Questions like, should we develop AI? Are there moral reasons not to develop AI? If AI could exist, what moral obligations should we have towards it? But also, is it possible? Right? Is AI even possible? The other two questions are more about morality, about ethics. But here, we're more interested in the metaphysics, right? Is AI possible? So that's the question we're going to look at today. So we're going to start with Turing's computing machinery and intelligence. The major idea that comes out of Turing's paper here is the imitation game. You might have heard of it. The idea is this. Instead of just asking, can machines think, we can design a kind of test, right? Turing specifically has in mind this kind of imitation game that today we typically just call a Turing test. So the game works like this. There's an interrogator who asks questions to some other person or potentially a thing, right, that is hidden from their view in another room, let's say. The interrogator's job, the questioner's job, is to figure out whether or not they're speaking to a person or a machine. Perhaps communicating is a better word than speaking here, right? They need to figure out whether they're communicating with a person or a machine. If there's a machine that's capable of successfully tricking the interrogator into thinking that it is a person, then, Turing says, it passes the test. Okay, so to pass the Turing test, then, at least for Turing, answers the question, can machines think? Well, if it passed the test, the answer is yes. Right? So he thinks, first, before we can dive in, there's a number of things that have to be made clear to make the test fair. First, obviously, the interrogator, the questioner, can't be allowed direct access to the questioned, right? You would recognize a robot if you saw it, the idea goes. And we're not here testing whether or not machines could ever look like humans. We're testing whether or not they could ever think like humans. So you got to be placed in separate rooms or something like that, right? Second, we're also not testing whether or not the machine can produce human-like sounds. That would be cool, but it doesn't really tell us whether or not the computer, the machine, whatever, can think. So all the responses, whether they're coming from a human or not, ought to be delivered by handout, printout, or some kind of digital interface, right? Like a chat client, something like that. If a machine can pass the imitation game, he thinks, we might as well say that the machine, the robot, can think, right? That it can think. Why this is the case comes out, I think, from the objections that he considers, how Turing responds to some of the objections that he faces. But as far as he's concerned, that just is the answer. If it can pass the imitation game, if it can pass the Turing test, then yes, the machine can think. Okay, so the first objection he considers is a theological objection. The idea is this. Machines can't think ever because they simply don't have souls, right? It's their lack of soul that makes it impossible for a machine to think. Turing thinks that this requires a couple of different theological assumptions that haven't been argued for, that haven't been motivated. First, it requires this kind of assumption that souls are responsible for thinking. The idea is this. You can believe in a soul and also not believe that a soul is what's responsible for allowing you to think, right? Souls might not be doing the job of producing thought. So if that's the case, well then a robot not having a soul doesn't mean that it cannot think. It just means that it doesn't have a soul. So even if you buy the idea of souls, you're still going to need this further assumption that souls are what does the thinking, right? Second, Turing says, this idea requires that God could not make ideas for machines. And Turing thinks that that's a very strange position for people who are willing to believe in the souls to take. Most people, Turing argues, who believe in something like a soul, think of God as being omnipotent. That means that there is no limit to God's power. Saying that machines can't have souls, then, is like saying that there is some limit on God's ability to give souls. So the idea is basically this. If God is powerful enough to give us souls, there's no reason why God couldn't give machines souls. Why not? If God's all powerful, why not? So it's not clear then, in other words, that robots necessarily lack souls. They might be given them, right? So just appealing to soulhood does not rule out the possibility straightforwardly of a robot being able to think. Okay, so it does not follow from the notion that there are souls that machines cannot think. Maybe souls aren't required for thinking. And if they are, there's no reason to think that God couldn't make souls for machines. So note that he doesn't really attack these theological notions at all. You could attack the very existence of souls. Turing doesn't feel like he needs to do that, right? Even if you accept that souls exist, it still seems like this objection doesn't necessarily follow. The second objection is much weaker, right? It's this sort of head in the sand objection. The idea goes like this. The idea of machines being able to think is very terrifying, right? I'd rather not think about that possibility because it's very scary to me. So it's better for us psychologically not to think that it's possible. Obviously, Turing thinks that this isn't a strong argumentative move, and thus he doesn't really consider it. He moves on very quickly, which I think he's right to do, right? Just because you don't want it to be true does not make it the case that it isn't true. The third objection is much more complicated. It's this sort of mathematical objection. The idea is this. Machines, like robots, artificial intelligence, is ultimately going to rely on mathematical, logical functions. So if we can find some kind of limitation to the operations of logic or mathematics, then machines are going to be similarly limited in their capacity to think. Why? Because their thinking is dependent on those things. So things like Gödel's incompleteness theorem do suggest that there are some limitations to any system of logic. They're going to be incomplete, right? There's nothing we can do about that. So machines are going to be limited in this way. Okay, Turing's reply is, again, pretty simple. That doesn't mean that they can't think. Why? Well, humans aren't perfect in their ability to think either. Just because they can't think perfectly, it doesn't mean that they can't think, right? Humans make mistakes all the time. Okay. This is probably the largest objection for our purposes, the objection from consciousness. So you ought to be somewhat familiar with this kind of objection by now, after we've covered it so extensively this semester. The idea behind this objection is that even if a machine is capable of tricking us into believing that it's thinking, it doesn't follow that the machine is thinking. Think back to that notion of philosophical zombie, right? You can behave as though you're having experiences, as though you're thinking, and not actually have those experiences. This is the same idea, right? It could be that a machine is capable of deceiving us into thinking that it is thinking, but there's no experience there. The machine is not experiencing what it means to think. It doesn't have conscious awareness. Okay. So Turing points out that this leads us down this sort of slippery philosophical slope. If we think that an outward expression of thought, something that seems to indicate that there is thinking there, behavioral indications that there's thinking, if we start to think that that's not enough evidence for believing that the thing is thinking, well, we're going to have to start applying that same standard to other humans. I don't have access to your experience. I don't have access to the feeling of your thinking. The only thing I have access to are your behaviors, the things you say, what you do, right? Just like I would have with the machine. Okay, so the idea then is this. If this objection is enough to deny thinking on behalf of machines, it ought to be enough then to deny thinking on behalf of other people. And this, Turing says, leads us towards solipsism. So solipsism is just the view that there's only one mind, and it's mine, right? For you, it would be yours, right? I am the only mind. All the other apparent minds are just features of my own mind, right? Perceptions, nothing more. And we don't want solipsism to be true, right? So the danger with this appeal to consciousness is that it means it's going to threaten, it's going to undermine our ability to think of other humans as thinking things as well. Okay, so with his response to this consciousness objection, we can now see why he thinks the imitation game is a good test for the question of whether or not a machine can think. It seems that for Turing, if a thing looks like it's thinking, smells like it's thinking, sounds like it's thinking, that's enough reason to think that it is thinking. Otherwise, we're not ever going to have good reason to believe that something is thinking, right? Passing the Turing test, appearing to think, is all the evidence you need if Turing is right. Okay, another important objection. It goes by Lady Lovelace's objection. So we're skipping. There are a few objections between that and this one. This, I think, is the next most important. In fact, a lot of people who work on this kind of thing think it's the most important objection. It goes something like this. So Lady Ada Lovelace argues that machines are incapable of thinking up anything novel. That is, a machine can only ever do what it has been programmed to do. It can't really discover anything itself. Okay. If that's true, then it might be that computers can imitate thinking without ever being able to think for themselves. They're more or less just following this preset program or following these rules that someone like a human has given them. They're not really doing any thinking. Turing, to Lady Lovelace's credit here, sort of just sidesteps the objection. Instead of taking it very seriously, which is not to say he doesn't take it seriously, but instead of taking it for what it is, he seems to reconstrue Lady Lovelace's objection as something like machines or computers can never surprise us, right? They can never surprise us, which is an importantly different claim than a computer can never do anything novel because it always abides by rules it's been given, right? So against the notion that computers can never surprise us, Turing argues that's clearly false for a couple of reasons. First, because even if we as humans give them all the rules, we aren't going to be able to do all the calculations that computers can do. And therefore, we are going to be surprised by some of the results, even if we put in the rules. We simply can't do the calculating. Second, just because a computer has been given some kind of initial instruction by a human, it doesn't follow then that the human knows what will come out of the instructions all taken together, right? So even if all the instructions individually have been given by a human, it doesn't follow that the humans know or that they fully understand what all the interactions of the rules will do when the computer, the machine, meets the world, right? So there are plenty of ways, Turing argues, that you could be surprised by what the computer's doing. But some people think, I personally think, Turing here is not addressing Lovelace's actual objection, which has to do with origination. This idea that a computer can never originate some kind of thought within itself, that it can't ever really surprise us. Typically, people who want to resist this kind of objection suggest that humans probably aren't very different. When we get into our conversation towards the end of the semester about conscious will, right, whether or not free will exists, we'll see this kind of discussion in depth. It might be the case that humans aren't capable of originating anything either, right? Okay, so let's jump in then to Searle. John Searle's Can Computers Think? He is going to resist Turing's notion that a machine could think if it passes the Turing test. First, he's going to clarify what the positions are at stake, right? He thinks what Turing wants to be the case, or what others who want computers to be able to think, what they're claiming is something he calls strong AI, right? Strong artificial intelligence. So strong artificial intelligence is the view that a machine could function in much the same way the human brain does. So there's no real difference functionally between a brain and a sufficiently advanced computer. Quote, the brain just happens to be one of an indefinitely large number of different kinds of hardware computers that could sustain the programs which make up human intelligence. So if strong AI is the case, then yeah, computers can definitely think if they're doing the exact same thing that human brains do, just in different kinds of matter, right? So Searle then is going to attempt to argue that strong AI is false. That strong AI is false. Now he wants to be clear that on behalf of those who do believe in the possibility of strong AI, merely believing that strong AI is possible does not mean you think that we have it now. It could be the case that you think, oh, strong AI is going to be way off, a couple 100 years, 50 years, whatever. It doesn't mean that strong AI is not possible, just because we don't have it now. Searle wants to make his claim very strong. He wants to say, not only do we not have strong AI right now, we can never have it. Computers can never think, can never genuinely think. His argument is basically going to be this. Computers are constrained to syntactical transformation, which means that they can manipulate symbols according to a variety of rules, but they don't understand what those symbols are. They don't understand meaning behind the symbols. For that reason, he thinks, a computer can never be said to truly think. It's a purely syntactical process. He gives us a case to facilitate our understanding here. It's a thought experiment. It's called the Chinese room. So first we're going to look at the quote, and then we'll unpack it ourselves. Okay, so here's the Chinese room. Suppose that I'm locked in a room and given a large batch of Chinese writing. I know no Chinese, either written or spoken. Now suppose further that after this first batch of Chinese writing, I am given a second batch of Chinese script together with a set of rules for correlating the second batch with the first batch. The rules are in English, and I understand these rules. They enable me to correlate one set of formal symbols with another set of formal symbols. And all that formal means here is that I can identify the symbols entirely by their shapes. Unknown to me, the people who are giving me all of these symbols call the first batch questions. Furthermore, they call the symbols I give them back in response to the first batch answers to the questions. And the sets of rules in English that they give me, they call the program. Suppose also that after a while I get so good at following the instructions for manipulating the Chinese symbols, and the programmers get so good at writing the programs, that from the external point of view, that is, from the point of view of someone outside the room in which I am locked, my answers to the questions are absolutely indistinguishable from those of native Chinese speakers. Okay, so if you didn't follow, the idea is this. You're locked in a room. There is a slot, like a mail slot. And occasionally, tiles get pushed through the mail slot that have on them depicted some Chinese character. You don't understand Chinese at all, right? To you, this is just a symbol. There's a book that you have that tells you, when you see this symbol, you should pull this other symbol out of a basket and pass it back through the slot. Unbeknownst to you, what you are doing is answering questions from people who do speak Chinese outside of the box. The idea is this: you inside the box might perfectly imitate someone who understands Chinese, but you don't know Chinese, right? So Searle thinks pretty clearly it would be inappropriate to say that the person in the room knows Chinese. It could perfectly trick someone into thinking that they do, but they don't know Chinese. What is happening is that they're merely transforming some Chinese symbols into others. They're merely undertaking the syntactical process. That's exactly what's happening, Searle thinks, when a machine passes the Turing test. It's simply tricking us into thinking that its purely syntactical transformations are something more. But that doesn't mean that the computer knows what it's saying. So if Searle is right, then there can't be anything like strong AI. There can only ever be weak AI, where weak AI is a sort of successful imitation of thought, not real thought, just a simulation of it. Okay, so there's lots of ways that philosophers have attempted to argue or object to Searle here. Some argue that, sure, Searle, you're right. The person within the box clearly does not understand Chinese. However, the room considered at large does, right? And thus, sure, the person playing the role of syntactical transformation, yeah, they don't understand Chinese, fine, but the box itself does, right? Where the box includes the person. That requires a sort of functionalist view, right? A view in which a thinking thing can be manifested over anything so long as the right kinds of functions are being implemented, right? Without that kind of view, it seems like that sort of counter is not going to get anywhere. It's not really going to get off the ground. Nevertheless, Turing and others like him can still keep applying to the same kind of move he used with the consciousness objection. Look, I have no way of discriminating between what you're talking about with a purely syntactical transformation and any other kind of transformation, whether it involves genuine understanding, genuine meaning, or not. When I engage with another human, I have no idea whether or not they're like a Chinese room or they genuinely understand that there's genuine meaning there. The evidence that I have is not enough to decide one direction or the other. And so, if Searle's case is enough to deny machines the possibility of thinking, it might be enough to deny other people the possibility of thinking. Yeah, when I say things to you, you seem to reply to me in a way that suggests to me that you understand what I'm saying. But that could just be because you're doing the syntactical transformation process within your mind, that there's nothing really there. I have no way of knowing. It's underdetermined. So people like Turing generally would respond to someone like Searle by saying, perhaps, but that sets a dangerous precedent where other human minds are concerned. Okay, so do robots have the ability to think? I'm not sure. Maybe Searle is right. Maybe Searle is right, and there's no way for them to advance beyond purely syntactical thinking. But if that's the case, maybe we're all in that boat. Maybe we're all in that boat. We'll hear more on thoughts like that when we get to our unit on free will. But for now, that's it. So stay healthy, stay safe, and see you next time.